From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Gustavo Morales, Deputy Director of the Mexican Cultural Institute of the Embassy of Mexico to the United States. I'm thrilled and honored to introduce today talented writer Valeria Luiselli. Valeria Luiselli is an incredibly accomplished young adult. From her academic career as a philosophy and literature major at the National Autonomous University of Mexico to her PhD in comparative literature at Columbia University. She is the author of several well-known books and also essays published by the New York Times, The New Yorker, and Dazed and Confused. She has been the recipient of two prestigious awards, the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction with the book Faces in the Crowd, and the National Book Foundation 535 Award. Luiselli goes through non-traditional paths in contemporary literature. Her novels are a compilation of fragmented narratives that poetically explore different times and spaces. Her writing is imaginatively nonlinear, and the diversity in her work is reflected in the ways she submerges herself in the different realms of literature and art. She shared the spotlight with musicians, cinematographers, and other contemporary artists, participating at BBC's The Arts Hour series, during which she spoke for her latest novel, The Story of My Teeth. The novel, commended through the fine art world, is an experimental work which began as a commission by the Galeria Jumex, a contemporary art gallery in Mexico City. It later grew and morphed according to the circumstances Luiselli set for herself, making her work unique not only on its completion, but also in its formation. This year, Simon Preston Gallery in New York City named their show Relingos, the Cartography of Empty Spaces, after an excerpt from Luiselli's book, Sidewalks. In continuously challenging her own writing, Luiselli has garnered recognition as a prominent literary figure. There is no doubt that Luiselli will continue to experiment using her knowledge and imagination to create contemporary works that innovate and demonstrate dedication to literature. Thank you, Valeria, for representing Mexico today at the National Book Festival.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I don't know if I represent Mexico. I don't think I represent anything except myself. That's enough of a burden to carry. I'm very happy to be here. It's been a delightful few days in Washington, D.C. I live with my family in Harlem, in New York. I've been living there for about 5 years. I was indeed born in Mexico, but I have spent most of my life outside Mexico. I was taken as a young child first to the States, where we lived for not even a year, and then my family moved to South Korea first in the late 80s, and there I spent 4 years. And then we moved to South Africa in 1994, right after the first democratic elections in South Africa. It was a very peculiar time in South Africa, and a wonderful one. There was a feeling that there was a country that was just being born. And a bit like in the Obama elections here, where I think people felt that they were participating in history somehow, and making history. South Africa felt like that in 1994. And there was a feeling that we were being part of something great and something important. I began writing during those years as a young teenager. I had a little balcony outside my room where I started basically not sleeping, while rather writing or reading. And I wasn't allowed to stay up late, but I started staying up late, and so it felt a bit of like a subversion to stay up late, disregarding the rules of the house, and read and write instead. So I had that initial relationship to literature. Thank you very much. I guess I was a teenager that had certain problems with authority, I mean, in a nerdish way. You know? This is my way of subverting authority with reading and writing late into the night. I wish I could give you a better story in those terms. And my family then moved back to Mexico, but I wasn't quite at home with being a foreigner in the country that I had always called home, even though it was always the country that was far. So I then decided to transfer myself to India, where I had found a scholarship to go to high school there. So I finished high school in India, and then moved between Mexico and Spain and France for a few years until I decided to do a PhD. Don't ask me why. You should never do a PhD. No, I'm joking. Please, young man, do a PhD. And I just very recently finished. And then I think, I mean, we are now a family settled in New York. My daughter is growing up in Harlem. She very much considers herself a Harlemite. She speaks to me in English, which is strange. So my motherhood is happening in English. And although I spoke English all my life, it's still strange to be a mother in not my mother tongue. Like English has become sort of like my daughter tongue. And I've always written in Spanish. My books, my 3 published books, I originally wrote in Spanish. But I've recently, well, not recently, but more now than before, began writing in English directly. I think I'm writing a novel in English right now, but I'm not so sure. I will know when I finish if I really did write a novel or what I did. And so, well, today it's very strange to just sit up here and talk about myself without no one asking me anything. So what I want to do today is just tell you briefly about my latest book, The Story of My Teeth, and how it came to be. And maybe then read very briefly. And then I'd like the rest of the session to be more of a Q&A with you. I'm interested in hearing your questions, and I hope you're interested in my answers. I suppose so, otherwise you might not be here. So yeah, this is what we'll do. So The Story of My Teeth, this is actually the unofficial official launch of the book. It actually comes out on September 15. So this is like a sort of sneak preview of the book and the first reading that I will actually do of the book in English. It's a book that was initially a commission. And it was a commission that came from something called the Humex Art Gallery, or the Humex Collection. So this Humex Collection is one of the biggest contemporary art collections in Latin America, maybe in the world. It's a very good collection of contemporary art. But the way that this collection is funded is that there's a factory that produces juices, that produces juice, Humex, which basically means Jugos Mexicanos, Humex, which is itself quite bizarre, right? That the production of juices ultimately funds an art collection of contemporary art. I'm not making this up. I do promise. You can Google it later on. So I received this commission. They asked me to write a fictional piece about one exhibition that they were starting to prepare. And they wanted me to write a kind of blog about the process of the exhibition, mounting. And I said, I don't do blogs. I never had a Tamagotchi when I was younger because they all died. And I don't know how to kind of feed technology in a way to sort of keep it alive. So blogs have always been a kind of abyss for me, and I've never had one. Or I had one, I was kind of forced to have one for a month, and I didn't even comply with that. So I said, no, I'm not blogging. But if you want me to write with a kind of constancy, and I don't know why they wanted me to write, maybe they wanted to make sure I was working. I said, I'll do that. I can write in installments. But I'm more interested in writing these installments for the factory workers at the juice factory and not so much for the curator and the gallerists. And they told me, well, that's a bit of a crazy idea. I'm not sure we can do that, but let's think about it. And I came up with a scheme for them. And the idea was to write an installment, send it over to the factory, have someone in the factory print out a kind of chapbook, a very cheap, homemade little chapbook that could then be distributed among the factory workers, in the hope for a few of them at least to become interested in reading these installments. And I didn't know how this was going to work. They didn't know how this was going to work, but we tried it out. And it did actually work. After the first installment, a group of about 12 factory workers became interested in forming a little reading group and reading my installments over the course of a few weeks or months. Now, this idea is not entirely my own. I wish I could say it was. It's a kind of combination of things. So in the 19th century, starting perhaps in the late 18th, but in the 19th century, in Cuba, there was something called the tobacco readers. And these were people in the factory that would kind of, I mean, if this was a factory, and imagine you were all rolling cigars there, and I was assigned factory reader for that day. Then I would come up in front of you while you're rolling cigars, and I would read maybe a chapter from Tolstoy, or sometimes it was really boring things like Spanish history, or like the history of the Spanish crown. But usually it was literature, and usually it was very good literature. So while the people were working, they would be hearing great modern authors. So I really liked that idea of literature sort of coming into a factory and doing whatever it could do. And that's where I took this idea from, forming this kind of reading group where I could send installments. And so the idea worked. The first time the factory workers came together and they recorded their session, and their session basically was basically composed of a reading out loud of my installment and then a discussion session about the reading. And in this discussion session, they would usually comment the reading and sometimes heavily criticize it, which was fascinating, or give kind of advice of where the story should go or what wasn't working, and all of this. And then they would sort of go off on a different path, and they would all end up just telling stories about themselves, or maybe they would hear maybe a line or a particular passage would spark an idea, and then they would tell a story that had happened to them once. And all this was recorded in an audio file. And that audio file was sent to me back in Harlem, and I would listen to it and make notes, and then think about the next installment, taking into consideration their comments, their own stories. And I slowly began to incorporate some of the factory workers' stories, and actually the factory workers themselves as characters, kind of characters in disguise, obviously changing their names. And it began to be a very beautiful exchange. It was something that was completely alive. I had never had an experience in writing in which I felt so thrilled and alive, basically. I thought that after that it would be kind of boring and solitary to go back to my more traditional way of working, which is just sitting in front of a piece of paper and noting down ideas. And this was, well, for me, a fascinating process. That they didn't only influence the story in terms of plot or certain characters, their voices also influenced the story. And there was one man in particular who had a very beautiful voice. He had a kind of picaresque thing about him. There was something kind of sly and funny, and he had just a tremendous sound when he read out loud. So I kind of took his voice and started working it into my narrator's voice. And the other thing that they influenced profoundly was the theme, the topic of the novel itself. Because when I began, I had no idea where I was going to go. And the way that their conversation influenced that particular aspect of the novel was that they often discussed what was going on in the gallery and the works that were being set up in the gallery space and kind of their relationship to that. And with absolute consciousness that their work ultimately funds or produces the money to buy this work. So I became fascinated in trying to explore the relationship between those two worlds of the factory and the factory workers and how that produces this other world or funds this other world. And I was of course interested in showing the huge gap between those two worlds. So ultimately this is a novel it's a novel that questions art and the value of objects. And it does so through narrative and through imitating processes in the contemporary art world and putting them in a kind of narrative setting. So for example, you all know Marcel Duchamp and the famous example of the how is it called in English? The mingitorio. No, not the new descending the staircase. The urinal, which is placed, sort of displaced from its original context and put into the context of a museum or a gallery, and therefore becomes kind of endowed with a value that it doesn't originally have just by its change of context or setting. So I wanted to do something similar, but also like in an inverse procedure. I wanted to take out objects, or in this case, subjects from their pantheon. So I took the names of authors and kind of put them in stories in which they weren't themselves. They were just names, empty names. So big authors, maybe like Borges, became bus drivers, or another writer became a seamstress. And I wanted to see how that kind of name dropping in the novel changed the value of the name as well as the narrative itself. I had this really crazy physics professor when I was in middle school, who explained gravity to us by like asking us to bring a big piece of cloth into the classroom, and we threw kind of tennis balls in there, and he explained how space worked in that same way, how gravity or mass, objects with a mass, shaped space by their mere presence. So I kind of wanted to do that, drop names as if they were tennis balls, and see what that did to the narrative. Heavy names that have certain associations for us and a certain content. Okay, so that's a very long-winded explanation or introduction to this novel. I'll read a little bit, and then we can just talk. Is that okay? The novel is called The Story of My Teeth. Yeah. I've been brushing my teeth very often since I discovered that publication date was a month away, because I realized that everyone was going to be looking at my teeth attentively for the next couple of months. And the first time that I actually had a kind of book signing was it was in a bookseller's pavilion. So a bunch of booksellers came to listen to me talk about the book and then take a copy. And one of them asked me if this was a memoir. So no, it's not a memoir. I'm the best auctioneer in the world, but no one knows this because I'm a discreet sort of man. My name is Gustavo Sanchez Sanchez, though people call me Highway, I believe with affection. I can imitate Janis Joplin after 2 rums. I can interpret Chinese fortune cookies. I can stand an egg upright on a table the way Christopher Columbus did in the famous anecdote. I know how to count an 8 in Japanese, ichi, ni, san, shi, go, roku, shichi, hachi. I can float on my back. This is a story of my teeth and my treatise on collectibles and the variable value of objects. As any other story, this one begins with a beginning, and then comes the middle, and then the end. The rest, as a friend of mine always says, is literature. Hyperbolics, parabolics, circulars, allegorics, and elliptics. I don't know what comes after that. Possibly ignominy, death, and finally post-mortem fame. At that point, it will no longer be my place to say anything in the first person. I will be a dead man, a happy, enviable man. Some have luck, some others have charisma. I've got a bit of both. My uncle, Solon Sanchez Fuentes, a salesman dealing in quality Italian ties, used to say that beauty, power, and early success fade away, and that they're a heavy burden for those who possess them because the prospect of their loss is a threat few can endure. I've never had to worry about that because there's nothing ephemeral in my nature. I have only permanent qualities. I inherited every last jot of my uncle's Solon's charisma, and he also left me an elegant Italian tie. That's all you need in this life to become a man of pedigree, he said. I was born in Pachuca, the beautiful windy city, with 4 premature teeth and my body completely covered in a very fine coat of fuzz. But I'm grateful for that inauspicious start because ugliness, as my other uncle, Euripides Lopez Sanchez, was given to saying, is character forming. When my father first saw me, he claimed his real son had been taken away by the new mother in the next room. He tried by various means, bureaucracy, blackmail, intimidation, to return me to the nurse who had handed me over. But Mom took me in her arms the moment she saw me, a tiny, brown, swollen blobfish. She had been trained to accept filth as her fate. Dad hadn't. The nurse explained to my parents that the presence of my 4 teeth was a rare condition in our country, but one that was not uncommon among other races. It was called congenital prenatal dentition. What kind of races? Asked my father, on the defensive. Caucasian, sir, said the nurse. But this child is as dark as the inside of a needle, Dad replied. Genetics is a science full of gods, Mr. Sanchez. That must have consoled my father. He finally resigned himself to carrying me home in his arms, wrapped up in a thick flannel blanket. Not long after my birth, we moved to Ecatepec, where Mom made a living cleaning other people's houses. Dad didn't clean anything, not even his own nails. They were thick, rough, and black. He used to par them with his teeth, not from anxiety, but because he was idle and overbearing. While I was doing my homework at the table, he would be silently studying them, stretched out by the fan in the green velvet armchair Mom inherited from Mr. Cortázar, our neighbor in 4A, after he died of tetanus. When Mr. Cortázar's progeny came to take away his belongings, they left us his macaw, Criteria, who suffered a terminal case of sadness after a few weeks, and the green velvet armchair where Dad took to lounging every evening. Lost to the world, he would study the damp patches on the ceiling while listening to public radio and pull off pieces of nail, 1 finger at a time. Starting with his little finger, he'd press a corner of the nail between his upper and lower central incisors, detach a tiny sliver, and in a single motion, tear off the half-moon of excess nail. After he'd detached the sliver, he'd hold it in his mouth for a moment or two, roll his tongue, and blow. It would shoot out and land on the notebook I was using to do my homework. The dogs would be barking outside in the street. I'd contemplate the piece of nail lying there, dead and dirty, a few millimeters from the point of my pencil. Then I'd draw a circle around it and go on doing my writing exercises, carefully avoiding the circle. Bits of nail would keep falling from the heavens onto my ruled scribe notebook like meteorites propelled by the current of air from the fan. ring, middle, index, and finally the thumb, and then the other hand. I'd go on fitting the letters around the small, circumferenced craters left on the page by Dad's airborne trash. When I was finished, I'd gather up the nails into a small pile and put them in my trouser pocket. Afterwards, in my bedroom, I'd place them in a paper envelope I kept under my pillow. During the course of my childhood, the nail collection got to be so large that I filled several envelopes. End of memory. I'll read until there for now. So we can open up a Q&A. I think that the modality is that you go up there. I'm not sure. Is that what I should say? Okay. So there are two microphones, and you can go up and just ask a question.
So you wrote that in Spanish?
That's a really difficult question. It shouldn't be, but it's a difficult question. Yes, I wrote this originally in Spanish.
And did you translate it?
No. I have a translator, a fantastic translator, Granta and McSweeney, with whom I work very closely. So all my books, not only this one, have a kind of Spanish version and English version. And the English version is never the same as the Spanish version, because once she produces a first draft in English, then I take that and I work on it as if it were just my first draft in English. And I write on top of that, and I change things around, and I notice things that didn't work in Spanish, because basically filtering it through another language brings out the areas that remain gray, ambivalent in a bad way, not in a good way. And that translation process basically implies a new beginning for me in English.
Do you think it'd be different if you had written it in English?
If I had written directly in English, I think so, very much. This particular book, yes, because the voice in this book, before I started kind of appropriating the voice from this man whom I heard reading in the factory, the voice I had in mind was my uncle's voice. So I have an uncle who's a salesman, and he works in one of Mexico City's biggest marketplaces called the Central de Abastos. You find anything there, from pieces of ham to car parts, stolen and not, to real estate, anything you want, birth certificates, fake, anything. And he's a merchant there, and he tells wonderful stories about the things that he sells. He's a kind of auctioneer, though he's not actually an auctioneer. He's also a man that has a denture that comes out, and he used to entertain us or sometimes horrify us when we were children, and take his denture off and make it dance in the table with salt and pepper, and he'd do entire shows with us. So he's a very lovable, wonderful man, and I've always wanted to write either about him or somehow with him in my right next to my ear. So initially the voice was his, and the character very much comes out of him. So no, I think if I would have written in English, it would have been difficult to kind of translate him into my own mind and then produce him in English.
You were talking about how within your book, by name dropping, you're kind of imitating what Duchamp did with the urinal with famous writers. I was wondering, do you think that your book is an object by taking these factory workers and changing their names? You're also kind of displacing them from, like Duchamp did with the urinal?
Yeah, it is a book of many displacements. Many things are displaced in the book. And the book itself, I guess, can be seen as an object, or like I think it would be very pretentious to say an art object, seeing as I'm definitely not a contemporary artist or a conceptual artist, and I don't see myself at all as doing work within the contemporary art or the conceptual art world. But because of the proximity of this book to the conceptual art world, it did kind of play with it in a kind of respectful but also sardonic way at times. And the book also became a different thing in English, and I started adding layers to it. So for example, the book in English, which I like much more than the book in Spanish, in fact, has an extra chapter, which is something fascinating. It's my translator, Christina, was getting really lost with all these names that I was dropping in the book. And so she started making a little list with all these names and producing little biographies about each of them. Tiny little biographies with just a few bits and pieces of information. But she did this so well, and her little descriptions of each character were so wonderful that when I saw them, we were in New York one day together, and she'd come over from England, and we were reading the novel out loud in English to see how it worked, and trying to find certain things and rhythms that weren't there in the very first draft. And she showed me this thing that she had made, and I loved it. And I said, this has to be part of the book. And it took some convincing, but at the end, my editors here in the States, Coffee House Press, who are wonderfully delirious and always want to try out things and are always keen to find new ways of working, they accepted, and they said, yeah, okay, we'll include this as a chapter. So there's another chapter which is written by my translator. It's a kind of glossary, but it's a glossary that plays with the rest of the novel too, a glossary of names. So yeah, I mean, this is very much an object, and it's a different object in every language also.
Thank you.
Would you care to talk about your work as a librettist for the New York City Ballet?
Yeah, sure. I've had a few lives, and so I'm a failed dancer. Did you have to bring that up? I'm joking. Thank you for the question. So the first time I arrived in New York because I wanted to dance. I had been dancing for many, many years since I was a little girl. And I had never been quite good, but it took me some time to realize that I didn't quite have a talent. You know, it takes time for one to realize that maybe one's not so good at their passion. So it took me a few years to realize that. So I went to New York. I started dancing with a little company and taking classes and intensives. And at the same time, I was starting to write my first book, and I realized that maybe I should change plans and focus on writing and not so much on dance. But through the years, I always looked for ways to work closely with dancers and to maybe remain close to the dance world, but just from my own space. And a few years ago, I think in 2009 or 10, I was approached by a wonderful choreographer whose name is Christopher Wheeldon, who is very experimental in the way that he approaches ballet. He works with a lot of literature or literary sources to put things together. He's changed the language of, he's very much considered like one of the heirs of Balanchine, but he's also modernized classical ballet in a very interesting way. And I was thrilled to work with him. What he had in mind was basically a ballet that was written in the 1940s by an Argentinian composer called Ginastera, who had a score with a few notations of plot for the ballet. But everything else, if there had ever been a libretto, that was lost. So we only had this one score. And there wasn't a lot of information about plot. So for me, it was more like a work of restoration, where I had to just listen to the score, look at it, and try and fill in the gaps, but not just sort of fill them in, but really produce something between them, or between the not gaps. So I wrote a ballet libretto. I think something that helped was that I knew that there are certain metaphors, for example, that a ballet dancer or a dancer will understand better than others. So I remember one of these metaphors was to think the ballet takes place in the Pampa, in the Argentinian Pampa, which is like Kansas, just this straight nothingness. No, there's no offense if anyone's from Kansas. It's a beautiful nothingness. It's just plains and plains of vacuum. And one French traveler in the 18th century had described the Pampas before as a horizontal vertigo. And this is a kind of strange metaphor for most people, I guess. But if you tell a dancer, you have to dance this as if this were a horizontal vertigo, they know exactly what to do with that. They know how their bodies would respond to something like that. So I was very careful in this libretto to kind of construct a language that would immediately resound with the dancers. And then it was fascinating just to see. I went to one rehearsal before the opening performance, and I actually liked the rehearsal better than the performance because it was beautiful to see all these dancers kind of a little bit snobbish, and they're all the New York City Ballet, so they're great, and they're all a little bit like competitive with each other, and all their tracksuit pants, and all of a sudden the choreographer comes in and hits the ground with a stick, and they all kind of just compose and produce in 3 dimensions what I had always kind of just conceived in 2. So yeah, that's my experience writing libretto. I haven't written a libretto since, but I've been working on an idea for a libretto based on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is a poem that I love and which I think is a ballet. You know, it should be seen as a ballet. But yeah, I haven't gotten a choreographer crazy enough to want to do The Wasteland. We'll see. Someday I'll find one.
Hello. So right now, identity is a big concept idea. What do you identify with? Not even specifically race or country. What do you identify with, and how does that translate in your work?
What do I identify with
As a person, as a writer, as a woman, as however you may feel.
Well, that's a complex question too. I mean, and when you speak about identity, I cannot not think of race and nationality and the kind of categories that define us, at least on paper, right? But I'll tell you a brief story or anecdote. When I arrived in the States to live here the first time I arrived was about 8 years ago, but I came back about 6 or so ago. And I was approached by someone asking me if I was interested in writing. It was an editor of a woman magazine. And she said to me, "Are you interested in writing a column about dating in New York as a woman of color?" So I said, "What? What does that even mean?" So I asked a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, who's a professor at Columbia. He teaches Harlem Renaissance, African-American literature. He's African-American, and we've been very good friends for a long time. And I said to him, I was laughing, I said, "Brent, this person asked me to write from the point of view of a woman of color." And he laughed at me, and he said, "But you are a woman of color." And I said, "No, I'm not." We're like, "What does that mean? Like, what are you saying?" You know? And he said, "Yeah, you are a woman of color." And it was like this strange realization of like how I was perceived here and what I had always been outside. Because I mean, in Mexico is an intensely racist country, but race is never discussed. And there are definitely there aren't all these categories that we have here. And you definitely don't have to identify with these categories on everything you fill out, like from your Dwayne Reed card to your anything. No? So first of all, it's very strange as a foreigner to come in and have to identify in all these niches. Then often, for example, Hispanic is treated as a race, but it's not. It's a linguistic group. You know? So that was all very confusing for me. But then, of course, I very happily, with time, embraced this identity, you know, of being a woman of color in the United States. Although in Mexico, I'm definitely not blonde, but in Mexico, I'm called a güera, which means like very despectively a blonde. You know? Like any American would be called a güero, or I would be called a güera. Obama would probably be called a güero. There's crazy categories of race, and it has to do more with with status and with certain things and with actual race. And the race that is always subjugated in Mexico is the indigenous Mexican race. So it's very complex. But I guess, and I mean, in terms of nationality, I mean, I know I'm Mexican. I know I'm Mexican when I watch soccer. That like something really like basic and terrible comes out in me, like all these like feelings of like of aggressiveness toward the opposing team, and this stupid patriotism flourishes everywhere in my body, and that's the only time I know I'm Mexican. Although I really like the U.S. women's team, like that, I would always root for them. Right. So I don't know, and I definitely identify as a Mexican writer, though more and more I live here, and I guess that also slowly makes me a Latino writer. I would have never said I was a Latino writer before. Maybe now I am, and if I'm writing in English, then I'm also more Latino. I don't know. It's confusing. Yeah. Take me to your shrink. I don't have a shrink. I need one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I have 5 minutes left. Sorry. Okay. I was supposed to be discreet about that, right? Okay. Sorry.
I'll be very quick.
Sure.
I find fascinating the way that you describe race. I agree, and I think another layer of this is class as well.
Yeah.
And your book is sort of a bridge to speak to a class that maybe you wouldn't speak to normally. Mm-hmm. Regarding the authors that you mention in your book, did you ever let the readers in on the sort of the joke? Did they ever access Borges and Cortázar as readers of those authors?
I think many, because things like Rubén Darío are authors that you have to read in school, and you have to read the worst Rubén Darío, not his good poems, but like his horrible things, and so everyone I remember in the reading, when they were reading out loud, everyone reacted to Rubén Darío's presence, but maybe not like a more obscure Russian writer, but they knew that their name was Russian, and they were like, why is this Russian name here? So they immediately understood the joke. There was no doubt about that. One thing that was interesting, though, beyond that, is that I decided to write under a male name, because I knew that most of my readers would be male, and that they might not welcome my text with such open arms had they known that I was a young adult woman. So I decided to write by the name Gustavo Sánchez Sánchez. And in the last exchange we had, I recorded just like a thank you message, because they had never heard me. They had only read me, and I always heard them. So in my thank you message, I said thank you for this amazing process, and it was really funny because that was itself recorded and sent back to me. So as soon as my voice like came out, they were all like, "Era vieja, oh my God!" So yeah, it was a moment.
Thank you.
All right, I think our time is up, but thank you very much. It's been lovely to talk to you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.